Evelyn Carter walked into the county courthouse on a cold November morning with the slow, deliberate movements of a woman whose life had never granted her the luxury of rushing. And though the years had bent her spine and thinned her breath, her presence carried a quiet endurance that demanded its own form of respect. The automatic doors opened with a mechanical sigh as she stepped inside, and the sudden contrast between the warmth of the interior and the brittle air she had just escaped made her eyes sting, not from temperature, but from the unspoken fear sitting heavily behind them. Her grandson Malik had hugged her tightly before school that morning, clinging to her coat longer than he should have, whispering that he would wait up for her no matter what time she came home. She had smiled and kissed his forehead, though deep inside her chest she carried a dread, so sharp it felt almost like a physical wound, because she had not told him that today the court might decide whether she remained free or whether he would go to sleep without her for nights that stretched longer than a child should endure. The lobby smelled of polished floor wax and old files, a scent Evelyn had come to associate with institutions that were meant to help, but often failed to understand the lives of the people who crossed their thresholds. She adjusted the frayed strap of her purse and moved toward the security checkpoint, her shoes making soft, slow taps against the gleaming floor. People passed her briskly, suits with steaming coffee cups, attorneys juggling case files, young clerks laughing too loudly at something on their phones, all existing in a world where time obeyed them instead of crushing them. She stepped through the metal detector and felt the familiar ripple of self-consciousness when the guard's eyes lingered a beat too long, not with suspicion, but with a detached pity she wished she didn't recognize so easily. Her court summons crinkled in her hand as she approached the elevator, and the memory of why she was here, the unpaid citations, the lapsed registration, the fees that grew each month like ivy around her neck, rose to the surface with an ache that reached behind her ribs. When the elevator doors opened on the third floor, a draft of cold air met her, carrying the muffled murmurs of people waiting outside the courtroom. She paused for a moment, resting her hand against the wall, gathering the strength to step into a room where she had no lawyer, no family, no allies, except the truth she would offer and the hope that truth still mattered. As she entered courtroom 3B, heads turned with the subtle curiosity people reserve for strangers who seem too alone for comfort. Evelyn kept her chin lifted, her grief tucked into the pockets of her coat, and took her place at the defendant's table, unaware that the man about to decide her fate, Judge Thomas Whitaker, was watching her with a gaze that carried ghosts of its own. Judge Whitaker lifted his eyes from the docket list when Evelyn stepped into the courtroom, and there was something about the slow, careful way she approached the table that tugged at a memory he had spent years folding into the quietest corners of himself. Her posture, dignified despite exhaustion, her neatly combed silver hair, the steady resolve in her tired eyes, all of it mirrored a woman he used to know, a woman who had raised him when life had peeled his world apart. He cleared his throat and adjusted the stack of files before him, reminding himself that sentiment had no place on the bench. Still, a faint tremor of recognition lingered like dust in the air. He began to review her file, flipping through pages that reduced a lifetime of struggle into sterile bullet points, multiple citations for an expired vehicle registration she could not afford to renew, missed court notices she never received because she had moved 3 times in 1 year, late fees compounded into a figure that exceeded her monthly income, and a warning that failure to appear today would have resulted in a warrant for her arrest. It was the kind of case he saw often, the kind that made him weary in ways he didn't admit out loud. Evelyn stood with her hands clasped in front of her, steady but visibly anxious, and when he asked her to confirm her name for the record, her voice carried a tremor she tried hard to hide. She spoke with the quiet clarity of someone who had learned to explain herself in rooms where understanding was rare and patience was thinner still. She described caring for Malik, her daughter's unexpected passing 3 years earlier, and the financial avalanche that followed, medical bills in her daughter's name, rent increases she struggled to meet, grocery costs that rose each month, electricity shut-off notices she negotiated extensions for, and the bus fare she withheld from herself so Malik could reach school with socks that matched. The courtroom remained silent as she spoke, and even the clerk paused in her typing, her eyes softening as Evelyn recounted her late daughter's battle with lupus and the way the illness had quietly stolen her strength, until one morning she simply did not wake. Judge Whitaker listened, his face composed yet strained, as though each word she uttered chipped away at his judicial detachment. Her grandson's name, Malek, echoed in his mind, long after she finished speaking, awakening memories of his own grandson, Jacob, a boy who had loved dinosaurs and peanut butter sandwiches, and who had left the world far too soon because an inattentive social worker missed signs she should have seen. As Evelyn's voice filled the courtroom with the raw truth of survival, he sensed that her presence there was not an act of irresponsibility, but one more symptom of a society failing those who could not afford its mercy. When she finally fell quiet, he leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers as he regarded her through the lens of a man trying to reconcile duty with conscience. The total fines had ballooned into an amount she could never realistically pay, and the law allowed him one of two choices: enforce the penalties as written, or seek a form of discretion, seldom used because it required stepping beyond the comfortable rigidity of procedure. He felt the weight of that decision press upon him as the courtroom waited, hushed and expectant, unaware that the line between judgment and justice was far more fragile than it appeared. When Judge Whitaker finally spoke, his voice carried a measured calm that did little to mask the emotional undercurrents shifting beneath it. And as he read aloud the list of fines Evelyn owed, her chest tightened painfully with each figure. The courtroom echoed with the hollow finality of numbers recited with bureaucratic precision: registration penalty, administrative surcharge, delinquency fees, late notice assessments. Each line item, a testament to how quickly the machinery of modern life transformed minor missteps into insurmountable obstacles. Evelyn kept her hands folded, her shoulders squared, but inside she could feel the fragile scaffolding of hope wavering. She could not go to jail, she told herself fiercely. Malik needed her. He had already lost a mother. He would not lose the only anchor left in his young life. As the judge continued, she found herself gripping the edge of the table, grounding her trembling resolve against the cold, unyielding wood beneath her fingertips. Across the room, a young public defender gathered her files quietly, watching the older woman with a dawning awareness that this was not simply another case among dozens she would encounter that day. This was a portrait of a system that punished those who were already exhausted by survival. Yet she said nothing, because the docket did not assign her to this case, and she had learned quickly that stepping forward without permission often did more harm than good. Still, her eyes lingered on Evelyn. Judge Whitaker set the papers down and reached for his glasses, removing them with a slow exhale that suggested a man wrestling with something heavier than procedure. He asked Evelyn why she had missed earlier hearings, and her answer, soft, steady, almost apologetic, explained how she had moved between apartments, how mail had gone astray, how her unpredictable work hours kept her from appearing during business days. She said these things without self-pity, only a bone-deep weariness. For a moment, the judge studied her in silence, the faint lines around his eyes deepening as the memory of his late daughter flickered across his thoughts. Loss had taught him more about grief than law school ever taught him about justice, and as he looked at Evelyn, he felt a sudden, unmistakable recognition. She was standing in the same place he had once stood, one small misstep away from losing everything that made life worth living. He cleared his throat and prepared to announce his ruling, but then he paused. Something in Evelyn's expression, perhaps the resolute dignity of a woman who had lived through storms fiercer than a courtroom, made him hesitate. He closed the file gently, not as a dismissal, but as a gesture laden with a gravity Evelyn did not yet understand. The courtroom grew still, the quiet deepening into something that resembled anticipation, as though everyone sensed that the next words spoken might alter the trajectory of more than one life. Before delivering the ruling, Judge Whittaker requested that Evelyn step forward, and though the gesture startled her, she obeyed, moving hesitantly toward the bench. Her footsteps echoed softly across the floor, her worn shoes tapping a rhythm that sounded like both endurance and exhaustion. When she reached the podium, she lifted her chin, meeting the judge's gaze with a mixture of fear and strength, as if silently reminding herself that she had weathered far worse than a courtroom's scrutiny. The judge leaned slightly forward, lowering his voice so that his words carried not authority, but an unexpected gentleness. He asked her about Malik, not the procedural details, but who he was as a child, what he liked to read, whether he had friends at school, what made him laugh, how he handled the weight of losing his mother. Evelyn answered with a depth of affection that filled the courtroom with a warmth it rarely witnessed. She spoke of how Malik loved drawing superheroes, how he struggled with asthma, how he whispered prayers into his pillow for his mother each night, and how she tried, with every ounce of strength remaining in her aging body, to shield him from the instability that nipped at their heels. The judge listened intently, his expression shifting from formal composure to something far more personal. The clerk glanced up from her computer, sensing that this was no ordinary exchange. Then, in a voice that carried the gravity of a confession long kept buried, Judge Whittaker revealed that he had once stood in a courtroom for a custody hearing of his own, fighting to keep his grandson after his daughter's addiction spiraled beyond control. He described, with steady but pained eloquence, the years he spent navigating social service offices, filing paperwork, attending hearings, pleading with the court to recognize the stability he could provide. He told her how, despite all his efforts, his grandson's fragile health declined rapidly, and by the time he secured custody, the boy's condition had worsened beyond recovery. Evelyn's breath caught as she listened, not because the judge's story mirrored hers, but because grief recognized grief, and in that moment, the roles of judge and defendant dissolved into something profoundly human. The room remained silent except for the faint hum of the overhead lights, a hum that seemed to underscore the truth that both of them carried losses that had shaped their lives far more deeply than any courtroom record could convey. And then, with a deliberation that startled even the bailiff, Judge Whittaker removed his black robe, folding it neatly and placing it beside him. It was a gesture so symbolic, so unexpectedly vulnerable, that the atmosphere shifted instantly. He looked at Evelyn not as a judge addressing a defendant, but as a grandfather addressing another caregiver, trying desperately to hold her family together without the robe. Judge Whittaker appeared transformed, not diminished, but more distinctly human. His authority no longer expressed through fabric or position, but through compassion forged from personal suffering. He stepped down from the elevated bench, and the distance between them, once defined by legal hierarchy, collapsed into the proximity of two individuals bound by the shared experience of loving children through insurmountable odds. The courtroom watched in collective stillness as he spoke directly to Evelyn, his voice steady yet tinged with the faintest tremble. He explained that while the law provided guidelines, its true purpose was never to punish the struggling to the point of collapse. It was to uphold fairness, equity, and humanity. He acknowledged that Evelyn had done everything within her limited means to keep Malik safe, fed, and loved, and that penalizing her for failing to meet financial obligations that exceeded her capacity was not justice, it was cruelty, disguised as procedure. The bailiff shifted awkwardly, clearly affected, while the young public defender lowered her gaze, blinking back tears she hadn't expected to feel during a routine morning docket. The judge then took Evelyn's thick, overstuffed collection of papers documenting years of struggle and placed it gently on the clerk's desk. He declared that the majority of the fines would be dismissed under judicial discretion, reserved for cases demonstrating exceptional hardship and moral integrity. The few remaining administrative penalties, he said, would be covered by a fund designed to assist individuals in circumstances like hers. Evelyn felt the room tilt slightly, not from faintness, but from the overwhelming relief that flooded her senses. She had prepared herself for the possibility of incarceration, of seeing Malik's face pressed against the window. As neighbors explained, she would not be home for dinner, but instead, she was hearing the first words of true compassion spoken to her by an institution that had often felt indifferent to her existence. But the judge was not finished. From the inside pocket of his suit jacket, he withdrew a card from a community advocacy group he personally supported, an organization dedicated to aiding grandparents raising grandchildren. He handed it to her, with the expression of someone offering not charity, but partnership. He explained that they could help her secure rental assistance, access medical support for Malik, and provide mentors who could guide him academically and emotionally. Evelyn took the card with a tremor of disbelief, her vision blurring as she realized the magnitude of what he was offering. It was not merely the dismissal of debt. It was the restoration of stability, dignity, and hope, things she had not allowed herself to imagine in years. The courtroom exhaled collectively as Evelyn absorbed the judge's words, her heart thudding with a mixture of amazement and gratitude that made her knees nearly buckle. She steadied herself by grasping the edge of the podium. The judge, noticing her tremor, guided her back to the defendant's table, with a gentle hand on her shoulder, a gesture so respectful and so unexpected that the room seemed to hold its breath. His assistant, normally brisk and indifferent, reached discreetly for a box of tissues and placed it within Evelyn's reach. The clerk, still silent, wiped her eyes quickly before returning to her computer. Evelyn sat down, exhaling a long breath she did not realize she'd been holding for months. Emotions swirled inside her like a tide she could not contain. She thought of Malik's notebooks filled with drawings, his hopeful questions about dinner, his nightly prayers for stability. For the first time in a long while, she saw a future that did not stretch out like one long corridor of worry, but instead unfurled into a path where possibility glimmered faintly at the horizon. The judge resumed his place at the bench, though he left his robe folded beside him and continued to address her with the same gentle firmness, ensuring she understood each step of the process that would follow. He dismissed the case fully. No probation, no community service she could not physically manage, no delayed monthly payments destined to suffocate her again. He explained carefully how the system had failed her, how poverty had been mistaken for negligence, and how she deserved not punishment, but support. Evelyn listened with the awe of someone hearing unexpected music fill a room long silent, and as she nodded, she caught glimpses of people in the audience, ordinary citizens, other defendants, a handful of lawyers looking at her not with pity, but with respect. Just as she prepared to gather her belongings, the doors at the back of the courtroom opened softly, and a young boy, Malik, hurried inside, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders. He had left school early when a neighbor told him his grandmother might be in trouble, and he had run the 2 blocks to the courthouse with the fierce determination of a child who had already lived through too much loss. He spotted her instantly, his face crumpling with relief as he sprinted toward her. Evelyn rose and embraced him tightly, burying her face in his hair, murmuring reassurances through the tears she had kept locked away for so long. The courtroom watched, many unable to conceal their own emotions, as the two held on to one another as though anchoring themselves against the tides of a world that too often forgot the fragile resilience of those surviving on its margins. Judge Whitaker remained standing behind the bench, observing the reunion with a solemn reverence that softened his features into a quiet tenderness. Malik eventually pulled back slightly, his wide, searching eyes shifting between his grandmother and the judge, trying to piece together a narrative grandmothers rarely explained fully. Seeing his confusion, the judge stepped down once more, but this time he knelt so that he was eye level with the boy. It was an act so gentle, so disarming, that even the guard lowered his rigid posture by instinct. He told Malik that his grandmother had shown extraordinary courage, that she had faced the court alone to protect him, and that she had carried weights he should never have to fear. The judge encouraged him to remain focused in school, to channel his grief into ambition, and to trust that adults like his grandmother were doing everything possible to ensure he had the chance to grow into someone who could change the world. Malik listened intently, his gaze flicker, as Evelyn and Malik stepped out of the courthouse into the crisp afternoon air. The world seemed to expand around them in a way that felt almost miraculous, as though the heavy gray that had hovered above their lives for years had finally begun to lift, revealing a sky painted in quiet hues of hope, rather than the foreboding tones of uncertainty they had grown accustomed to. The courthouse steps stretched before them like a symbolic descent from fear toward freedom, and as Evelyn gripped Malik's hand, she felt a steadiness return to her body, a sensation she had long forgotten, one that resembled strength, and perhaps even rebirth. People who had witnessed the hearing now exited the building in small clusters, some casting lingering glances toward the pair with softened expressions, their earlier detachment replaced by a humbled awareness that a story far larger than a stack of fines or missed court date had unfolded inside those solemn walls. The cold breeze carried with it the distant hum of traffic, the rustling of fallen leaves, and the faint chatter of pedestrians passing by. But for Evelyn, every sound felt somehow gentler, as though the city itself had chosen, just this once, not to press its weight upon her shoulders. Malik walked beside her with a renewed lightness, asking questions about what the judge had said, what the future might hold, and whether all of this meant they could finally stop worrying every time the mail arrived. Evelyn answered each question thoughtfully, her voice warm and steady, unhurried for the first time in years. She explained that, although challenges would still come, they no longer approached life as a pair hunted by debt and consequences. Instead, they walked forward as a small family newly fortified by the affirmation that kindness, though rare, could still be found in places once feared, a few steps behind them. Judge Whitaker emerged from the courthouse, pausing briefly at the top of the stairs, as if to witness their departure not as a figure of authority, but as a man quietly witnessing the turning of a page, one that reminded him of the many he himself had longed to rewrite in his own life. He observed Evelyn, leading Malik toward the bus stop, her back straighter, her pace more confident, and he felt the faintest wash of solace settle over him, a soft redemption carried not by grand gestures, but by the knowledge that he had helped prevent a child from slipping through the same cracks that had claimed his grandson. After a moment, he turned away and descended the opposite side of the steps, blending into the flow of pedestrians with the contemplative air of someone who had just chosen humanity over procedure, and discovered that the choice had restored something inside him he thought permanently lost at the bus stop. Evelyn and Malik sat close together on the bench, the warmth of their joined hands radiating a wordless promise of better days ahead. Cars passed by, and the sun began lowering toward the horizon, casting a golden glow over the street and catching in the strands of Evelyn's silver hair. Malik leaned his head against her shoulder, exhausted from the emotion of the day, but safe in the certainty that he would not face another night without her presence guiding him. As the bus approached with a rumble and a hiss, Evelyn stood, helping Malik rise with a gentle squeeze of his hand, and she felt, for the first time in what seemed like an entire lifetime, that the road before them, though still uncertain, no longer felt like a burden she carried alone. They boarded the bus, choosing a seat by the window where Malik pressed his palm against the cool glass and watched the world blur into streaks of amber and blue. Evelyn settled beside him, closing her eyes briefly, not in weariness but in gratitude. Gratitude for the judge who chose compassion over convenience, for the strangers who had witnessed her story and perhaps reconsidered their assumptions about the quiet battles others fought. and for the child beside her who gave her every reason to keep walking. As the bus pulled away from the curb, carrying them farther from the courthouse and closer to a modest apartment where warmth waited in the form of shared meals and whispered, nighttime prayers, Evelyn realized that just as true justice was not measured in fines or sentences, but in the rare moments when someone with power paused long enough to see the person standing before them not as a case file, but as a fragile, valiant human being trying desperately to keep her family intact. And in that single afternoon, through the simple act of recognizing her humanity, Judge Whitaker had not merely changed the outcome of a case, he had changed the direction of two intertwined lives, proving that the smallest measure of compassion could become the strongest force of transformation.